No one ever told me that grief felt so like fear. I'm not afraid, but the sensation is like being afraid. The same fluttering in the stomach, the same restlessness, the yawning. I keep on swallowing. At other times, it feels like being mildly drunk or concussed. There is a sort of invisible blanket between the world and me. I find it hard to take in what anyone says, or perhaps hard to want to take it in. It is so uninteresting. Yet I want the others to be about me. I dread the moments when the house is empty. If only they would talk to one another and not to me. Good afternoon, Brollies. It is important for us as the leaders within Brol to be fully equipped with the tools to lead our teams on good days as well as the more challenging ones. Today, I opened with a quote from C.S. Lewis's book, A Grief Observed, which he wrote in 1961 while mourning the death of his wife due to cancer, and how faith helped him survive it. By now, I'm sure we are all aware of the order of proceedings. These sessions act as a catalyst for open, practical discussions around vital leadership tools and strategies. Today, we look at one of the more challenging responsibilities leaders bear, and that is assisting our teams when they're enduring a period of grief. On Tuesday, we touched on how one can support a colleague or a loved one when they're going through grief. Today, we will build on that and discuss how exactly we can create a workplace culture that is open and equipped to assist those navigating through the grieving process. As we covered earlier this week, grief is natural and it's unavoidable. These two facts make it an important discussion for us as leaders. Even if you have not experienced a frontline bereavement, such as the loss of a partner, parent, or child, you've certainly lost something you value, a marriage or a job, or some aspect of mind or body that defines who you are. Perhaps you have just lost yourself, lost your chances or your reputation or integrity, or chosen to lose bad memories by pushing them into personal and portable tombs. Perhaps you've just merely wasted time. You may recognize today's speakers from Tuesday's session. Dr. Stanley is the psychologist and coach based in Johannesburg. He has been working with multinational organizations over the past 30 years as an organizational psychologist and held various HR leadership roles. Dr. Stanley worked as an international director at ActionAid, a global anti-poverty agency working across Africa, Asia, and Europe. He is also the chair of Flying for Life, a local NGO, and a lay minister in the Methodist Church. Assisting Dr. Stanley in facilitating today's session, who you may recognize from previous inner course sessions, is Marina Pretorius. Marina is a highly experienced industrial and organizational psychologist with a demonstrated history of working in the human capital industry and consulting. She's currently consulting for Brol Property Group and working closely in partnership with the group human capital team. Welcome, Dr. Stanley and Marina, and thank you for being with us today. Before I hand over to Dr. Stanley for today's session, I would like to encourage you all to keep the members of your teams in mind. In doing so, you might find a connection with the content and a team member. I wish you all have a fruitful session. Thanks, Dr. Stanley. Over to you.
Thank you, Nolene, for the warm welcome. And it's good to be together with you again in this follow-up session. As Nolene has introduced, grief is a common experience for all of us as human beings. But we were just having a chat just in preparation for the webinar and reflecting on the fact that despite it being a common human experience, we have very little training, we hardly participate in conversations, and it's not a life skill that we learn. And so I hope that in our time today, that this is a meaningful space and an invitation to start conversations in your teams, in your family, and in your friendship circles. I'm just curious to find out, as we're getting along, I'm going to ask you to please participate with me, make comments in the chat box. If you have a question, please pop that in, and we will have a chance to get to your questions as we go through. But I'm just interested, how many of you joining today's webinar also participated on Tuesday? It will just give me a sense of how much I need to cover or I can fast track. So if you participated in the Tuesday webinar, please say yes in the chat. And Marina, if you can just give me a sense of how many people are new to the topic. Thank you.
Yes, so there seems to be quite a few people. We're now about 25, and it seems that at least half of the people did attend the first session.
Okay, thanks, thanks, Marina. So I'm going to ask the indulgence of those that attended the first session. I'm going to cover a little bit of the content, but I've really cut it down so it's more a refresher for you. And for those that did not participate in the Tuesday session, hopefully it gives you a feeling for what we covered, and the recorded session in its entirety will be available for you from your teams. So what would I like to cover? We've got two parts to our webinar today. The first part, I really want to touch back on some of the topics we covered on Tuesday. So how do we cope in this time of the pandemic? What's happening in terms of stress? And what's our brain response typically? And then I want to touch a little bit less than I did on Tuesday in understanding grief, looking at some coping strategies and how grief is part of our healing journey. Then we'll take a breakout group discussion time and come back. And then I want to focus in very much from a leadership, management and leadership perspective. What are some organizational strategies for grief support that you can consider as a role? And then how do we equip line managers and leaders as the first responders, because you're often the ones that are needing to deal with people in your team. So this is what we'll cover in the first and second part. So starting with grief again as an introduction. And why does this topic matter? And here I'm focusing very much on three categories. First, as leaders, I think whenever there is a crisis, as the pandemic has created a crisis globally, nationally, people are looking to leaders for direction, support, guidance. And often leaders are not always equipped to cover different types of crises. And I'm hoping that through this conversation we have this afternoon, that you feel equipped and confident as a leader in the organization to be able to talk about this topic, to give some practical guidance, and to also think about how the organization can respond going forward. And then you might be in the second group, you might be a line manager having people responsibility. And often line managers are the front line of psychological first aid, as we call it. You are the ones that listen to the first stories. You are the ones that are needing to respond to that employee that is calling in and saying, I've just lost a loved one. And so how do you prepare yourself, and what skills will be helpful for line managers? So not wanting to make you psychologists, but you are the first line responders, and your work and the way you engage staff really matters in their grief journey. And then you might be in the employee group, and sometimes we are in all three of these groups. So I just want to talk about what will be helpful for employees, both in terms of the psychological support, but also from an organizational perspective. What can organizations do in a formal, structured way that will be helpful for employees? So I'm hoping through our conversation that we really recognize that grief is a collective human experience, that through our conversation we can normalize grief, that this is not something abnormal, it's not something that we should avoid, but it's a part of our life. And then to ask what would be helpful organizational strategy. So this is how we're going to proceed. On Tuesday, I was talking about different levels of grief, and especially in the context that we find ourselves in South Africa, in Africa, and from a global perspective. 2 or 3 years ago, we would have typically dealt with what we call normal bereavement. Any one of us might have lost a loved one, a friend, brother, sister, or even our elderly parent. And in many ways, this bereavement is expected, and so we are able to better handle it. And as organizations also, we would often send some messages of bereavement, flowers, this person takes time off, and as a manager, you often would come alongside your staff member, even attend a funeral. That would have been 2 or 3 years ago, but that's now shifted. So what we've now entered into is very much this phase of grief, which we call complicated grief. So what would have been easy to navigate, a very natural part of our lives, we are now entering into this phase of complicated grief. And the pandemic and COVID-19 in particular, in the way that it manifests, has created this experience of complicated grief. So now all of the things that we could do, we're unable to do. We can't be with our loved ones. We cannot attend funerals. We cannot see the body. Where there would have been a prolonged time, everything is really cut short. So this changes the nature of grief and grieving. And so it does require a different way of coping. And we are not prepared for this. And organizations too must consider, what can we do differently? The third grief I'm describing as chronic grief. And I was just saying that, and looking at some of the research from trauma and grief counselors, where they are predicting that this grief that we're experiencing as a result of the pandemic almost feels like a tsunami. And this is what we're experiencing right now. The wave has hit us. But the effects, the after effects, the aftershock of this tsunami experience is predicted to stay with us for another 2 to 3 years. So even when we are past dealing with COVID-19 as a pandemic, we will still, in the next 2-3 years afterwards, be dealing with the aftermath. And so this begs the question, what does it mean for individuals, for communities, and for organizations? So we are not in level 1 in terms of our bereavement anymore. The whole playing field has shifted. From an organizational perspective, and I'm talking largely to managers and leaders this afternoon, there's an interesting quotation here from the International Labour Organization, just saying how COVID-19 has impacted the mental health of staff. It's created a psychosocial crisis, and this is an observation by the ILO, which guides on labor standards globally. And the second quotation is really important. At the same time, managers and leaders have a critical role to play in protecting their workers from the stress and psychological pressure generated by the pandemic. So unlike before, there is an increasing recognition that organizations have to take a more hands-on approach to the mental well-being of their staff. And the way I understand your core series, I think you've started that. And it's a wonderful initiative that you have. But just like in the past, where we would have had significant time, attention, and protocols around health and safety, looking more at the physical, we also need to start including the mental well-being as part of our health, safety, and well-being protocols. So this is a call from the International Labour Organization. And I think increasingly over the next 2 to 3 years, we're going to find that we will start to have more international protocols around mental and psychosocial well-being in the workplace. I talked a little bit about on Tuesday on stress, on COVID-19, and what is the implication and why does this experience just become that much bigger? And so what we're finding internationally is that there is an increase in stress overall, and particularly in depression and anxiety as mental health factors. And where staff would have experienced mental illness before, it's becoming worse. And often because mental illness is such a silent topic, much like grief, we don't talk about it. You're going to find more and more staff just absorbed in their own spaces, maybe increasing loneliness. The incidence of suicide is increasing. And so the whole remote working, not being in contact with colleagues, being in contact with the teams, is going to start creating another dynamic. So I'm just also encouraging managers and leaders to just be aware, watch the space. And all of this is really something we thought will happen quickly, we'll get over it, we'll end our lockdowns, but it's progressing, it's prolonged. And this, whenever there's a prolonged experience, even our stress coping mechanisms that we are used to get stretched. And so we're in a very unusual time and space. And then if you're following the news, and especially this is a phenomenon in the US and a big part of the US, they're talking about the Great Resignation, where a lot of staff are saying, and fair enough, these are more office workers and knowledge workers. They're saying, we really don't want to sign up for work. We want to take time out and just ask, what is the meaning of life? Start to do things that we didn't do, just understanding that life is so short and time is short. So in the US, a lot of organizations and human resources, human capital strategists are thinking actively, because this, in some cases, a brain drain, and in some cases, a retention crisis for large organizations. I don't know that it's as prevalent or real or right now as serious in South Africa, but I imagine that this is something that's also going to sweep into our space. So the context is changing, the demands of being in the workplace and being responsive as leaders and managers is shifting. I talked also on Tuesday just about different stages and theories of grief and grieving. I'm just going to pick one, which in a way summarizes some of the healing and the process that is required in grief and grieving. And this model is called the dual process of coping. And I was giving the imagery of a wave. So imagine yourself standing on the shore of a beach and the wave is coming. The first wave is fine, it's gentle, it laps on your feet, and you can manage that. And so the second wave comes and it also feels manageable. And then you have this big wave that really knocks you off your feet. And so when people are experiencing grief and grieving, it's a process, it takes time. And it goes through almost different phases and stages, and it's very different for different people. So what we find that the grief work is really moving between dealing with my loss on the left and then moving forward on the right. So there's a there is a moving between the two. Immediately after the death of a loved one, we've got to attend to funeral service. So that's dealing with the loss. We've got to attend to memorials. And then we might be back to work. And when we're back to work, everybody thinks it's all okay because now we're back to work. But this is not really the case. And so the next week, we are having to deal with different aspects, our deep emotions of anger, sadness, frustration, fear, loneliness. We get back into the workplace and we start to make adjustments. And so in time, we are getting our children to adjust to not having a mom or a dad or an uncle or brother. We start in time to make new friends, and that's a slow process. We start to make adjustments and eventually get to this place of acceptance. But there is no one way. It's not a straight line. All of this is happening, and sometimes very chaotically for all of us. And so this is what makes grief, as I described earlier on, complicated. There is no pattern, there is no formula, and each of us experience grief in our own very particular and personal ways. But now added to this, you have COVID-19, the pandemic, and all of its complication. And then added to this is this idea of collective and chronic grief. It's not just a few families and communities that are grieving, but the whole world in different ways is grieving. So there is a complication. What would have been easy, simple is now just exploded into something that we're not really prepared for. I spoke also about religion, culture, and mourning, that an important part of grief and grieving are our rituals of mourning. And these are connected to our religious and our faith, or it's connected to our culture. And these pictures just depict different mourning rituals and funeral ceremonies, in particular Ghana, in the middle, a Hindu woman, on the right, South African and kind of ethnic group, on the bottom left, a Jewish funeral, and on the right, a Muslim bereaved person. So all of us have our own particular cultural experiences, our religious experiences, which make a demand on us. And there is an ask that we follow some of these practices and rituals. And then on top of that, we have our individual family dynamics that are also mixed up in all of this. And especially when there's loss, it gets complicated. It really saddens me to hear stories of some families that have so much of conflict at the time of funerals and grieving. But this is a reality which we have to navigate through. And so in each of the countries, in each of the cultures, in each of the religious contexts, there is another layer that is added to our grief and grieving. And most often it helps to have these communal practices. And sometimes, as we are experiencing now, it's becoming a source of stress, because a lot of the rituals and practices that communities and people of different cultural groups would have participated in, they're unable to. And so it just leaves this feeling of unfinished business, especially in the African cultures, where there's a lot of veneration and importance of ancestors and the way the dead are honored. A lot of those rituals we cannot complete satisfactorily. So there is an incompleteness in our experience of grief. And so this plays into our continued and almost a chronic sense of grief. And so who would have imagined that we'd be attending funeral services via video or Zoom? But this has become very much the new norm for us. It's very awkward. It's not what we used to. It's not what we should become used to, because this is so unnatural. But this is what we are forced to do. And so there's a lot of conflict in us. How do you say goodbye virtually? How do you not be there for those that are bereaved, your family, friends? So there's a lot of open-endedness in all of this. And then added to it is our different aspects. Survivor guilt is one of the things that we're often confronted with. Often in some families, many of the family members are passing away due to COVID, and there might be one person that's left. And they have to deal with the survivor guilt. Why me? Why have I been spared? And so there's a burden that goes with that. And especially for children that have lost their parents and have to take on new responsibilities, it becomes really, really challenging. And as we reflect, death is part of life. So we're going to experience, if you just follow the curve with me, we're going to experience trauma, suffering, and death is an experience of suffering, which is a normal part of life. And we're going to get to this bottom pit, our dark night, where everything feels just hopeless, gloomy, and sometimes you just want to give up. But in this time, there is an opportunity to come back up again, restore hope, to grow and to be healed. And often what helps are people that come alongside us. So it could be our friends, our family, our priest, or it could be a colleague at work, a line manager that really steps in and says, you're not alone, I'm here with you. And so I really want to encourage you as line leaders to recognize that your role, in however small it might feel, could be that turnaround point for somebody to know that they're not alone, that they can get through this and things will get better. I often speak to staff at work and I ask, what's been most helpful for you in your time of bereavement? And they say, my line manager, just calling, checking how I'm doing. Just those small gestures are so meaningful and so powerful. So I really want to encourage you, line managers who are in the front line and leaders in the organization. You can help people move out of this gloomy curve. So that brings us to the end of our first discussion. And we're going to break out into groups just now. And there's two questions that Marina and I thought that you could have a conversation around, and they put up on the screen for you. So what have you found most helpful in coping with your personal grief? So bring it to you. What's been your personal experience, not only in this time, but over the years, and share some of that with your colleagues. And then the second one, you might want to talk about this in your group. How have you experienced the implications of complicated grief? As I'm describing, we're now not dealing with normal grief. Things have just spiraled out. It's now in this complicated grief. What is the implication and impact on organizations? So you might want to talk to that. I'm going to hand over to Marina to guide us through the next process.
Thank you, Dr. Stanley, and thank you for that recap and verbalizing the way that we've all probably experienced grief in this time. Colleagues, so we've had some feedback from the larger group that these interactions with your colleagues are actually most meaningful, and we're therefore going to continue with this. So we're going to divide you up into smaller groups now. It's again going to be 10 minutes where you can converse around these topics and open up the conversation. And I really want to encourage you to make the best of your time, also to share around your experiences of grief as it builds our own capacity to deal with this. So an open invitation. We'll return you automatically to the main room in 10 minutes, and you, as you've now become accustomed to, will see the countdown, and then we'll continue with the second stage of Dr. Stanley's presentation. Thank you. Welcome everyone, and back into the large room. I think if you've had the same experience than we had in our small group, we did not get to really talk about the second questions of how you have experienced the implications of complicated and prolonged grief in your team. And I really want to welcome you and ask you to please respond to that question in the chat if you have any insights to share. The purpose of us being together as a group is to share common experiences. And yeah, if you could respond in the chat, I'll really appreciate it. Of how did you experience this impact? We've been in the COVID period for a long time, 18 months and more. And how have you experienced the impact in the organization and in your teams specifically? But while you answer there, back to Dr. Stanley in going into our second phase of the presentation. Thank you, Stanley.
Thanks, Marina, for facilitating, and thank you all for participating. At least for the little group that I was in together with Marina, we had a good, open conversation, which is so important. I wanted to share a poem that I wrote this year in July. And this was on the back of all of the unrest in the country and just the escalation of grief that we're so much experiencing. And it was also in response to a lot of my friends just feeling so overwhelmed. So I'll read my poem. It's called Too Much. When it is just too much, pause, take time out. When it's too much, take a deep breath. When it's too much, say a silent prayer. When it's too much, ask someone for help. When it's too much, know it's okay to say, I can't cope. I can't do this. When it's too much, know that you are more and that you are not alone. When it's too much, know that this too will pass, especially when it feels just too much. I'll share this poem with you in the final pack, but this is how it's felt for a lot of us. It's just too much, and it's okay to say that. It's just too much. And in our small group, we're hearing that the grief is not just about losing a loved one, but it's also losing ourselves, losing our routine, losing our sense of identity and control. So it's a much bigger conversation about grief. And so if it's too much, say it is too much, and look for helping in your organization, in your friendship circle. So I want to talk about what about organizations and what can organizations do in terms of creating space to handle grief. I presented, and this is where Marina kind of connected with me at the Industrial Psychology conference a month or two ago. And in preparation for that, I did a quick survey with a few organizations. And this was a very quick qualitative survey. And 10 companies responded. And I was just interested to ask and know to what extent are organizations prepared in terms of coping with grief, and especially in relation to COVID. So of the 10 organizations that responded, at least 70% had between 1 and 10 of their staff that they lost in this time of COVID. And 30% of organizations lost more than 10 staff. So this is quite significant. I asked to what extent is grief specifically covered in your well-being policy? This was a 50-50 in the response. I asked about line managers and to what extent they are trained to support grief. 70% said no, and 30% said yes. And the big ask was that more line managers get trained. I also asked to what extent is your organization having any grief awareness and education, and 70% said no, and 30% said yes. So I really want to applaud you, as I did on Tuesday. I think your initiative goes a long way in creating space for staff and also for line managers and organization leaders. So there is a big need in organizations to be prepared and to prepare staff for the challenges. David Kessler, and again, it's a good reference. There's a Harvard Business Review article, which I will also share the resource reference. August 2020, David Kessler has done a lot of work on grief and grieving. He's one of the experts internationally. And this article was targeted more especially to organizational leaders. And he was saying that leaders must recognize people's grief and assist them in finding meaning. And in the article, and this is really a summary, he's saying that in our workplace, there are typically three categories of people. The first category of people that we will have in our workplace, he describes as the worried well. So people that are well, that are not sick, that are not physically affected by the pandemic, but have an overwhelming worry and anxiety as to what is going to happen. Am I going to be okay? Is my family going to be okay? Is my team going to be okay? So that's the one group that we have amongst ourselves. And this group is grieving in their own way. Then the second group, David Kessler calls the affected, those that are directly affected by the loss of someone in their extended families, a friend, a colleague in the workplace that they know of that has passed away or is ill. So you are in that affected group. And the way your experience plays out is going to be different because now this is touching you in that personal space. And then the third group, which we are more familiar with, are the bereaved, those that have actually lost a loved one, a friend, a colleague in the workplace. And so there are these three groups of people in the workplace. And so it'll be helpful for us as line managers and leaders just to get a sense of our staff and where are they. I imagine a lot of our staff will be in the worried well, and there might be some in the affected and a fewer in the bereaved. So just be aware that grief will show up differently for all of these people. And it's not only grief for the bereaved, but grief also for those that are affected and grief for those that are anticipating something happening. And in psychology, we talk about this idea of anticipatory grief. For myself, as I shared on Tuesday, my mom passed away at 92. She was in hospital for a while, and then I brought her back home. And so we had just over a week with her. And it was a time of anticipatory grief. We knew she was going to pass. We knew in the month she was going to pass. And so the grieving starts even before the actual event of loss. So this is just a way of thinking and being aware of the people that are amongst us. From an organizational perspective, I want to suggest that we consider an integrated approach to grief at work. We can look at the policies and procedures, and these are important to set some kind of formal structure. And then we also need to train up our line managers, equip them so that they feel confident and have some of the skills to be able to do this frontline grief work. But connecting these two are what I would call compassionate culture. To what extent do organizations create and have a compassionate culture? And this is not only for this time of grieving, but a compassionate culture is a way of being in an organization that hopefully stays as part of the DNA and the organizational culture. And more as we do culture surveys and we talk to people and ask about what retention strategies and what would keep you here, people want to be in a place where there is compassion. This is a very basic human need. We know that workplaces tend to, and this is a stereotype, tend to be harsh, demanding, but those workplaces that are compassionate, and compassion is not a soft thing. Compassion is very demanding, it's hard, and it does require intentionality. But those cultures that have compassion inbuilt in them have a way of retaining more people, bringing up a high level of productivity and discretionary effort. This is doing what is more than expected. You would not find those qualities in cultures that are not compassionate. So the invitation is to look at all three, and I will just unpack some of these in a little more detail as we get through. So in summary, I want to suggest there's 5 organizational practices that you can consider. One is having a well-being policy that has a specific reference to grief and bereavement. And so this doesn't have to be complicated, but it just gives permission for the organization to deal with grief and bereavement, and all of your leave arrangements, time off, how you support are kind of covered in this. The second is what we're doing today is leadership and management awareness around grief specifically, and mental health as a cover or an umbrella of grief. And then 3, training line managers more specifically in terms of frontline psychological skills. Again, today is a part of that. 4, it's how do you get this almost a seamless partnership between a line manager, your HR or human capital as you have it, an external psychologist that's working with you, so that anyone in need has a quick referral channel and we're not kind of tripping over ourselves to provide the necessary support. And then 5 is this culture of compassion, which I'm going to talk about in a little more detail. So starting with policy perspective, I'm not going to go into too much of detail here and really offer this from a human capital perspective, but these are some of the elements that can be considered in terms of a policy. A specific section on grief and bereavement, and then being clear on what are the roles and responsibilities of line managers and HR. So often in many organizations, everything is kind of outsourced to HR. It's not a good practice. Line managers, you are the first line. Your primary responsibility is your people. HR is an enabler and support. Be very clear on external service providers. You might have a well-being service company, or as you have now, industrial psychologists are helping you. Be clear on what is available from them and how that service is communicated internally. What kind of financial support would be provided for people that are grieving, not only in bereavement, but in other types of grief care? Who's included, who's excluded? Often our inclusions tend to be very nuclear. It's just that immediate person or the family, but in our cultural context, often this needs to extend to even sometimes the extended family. So think about how that is possible within the limits that you have. Time off for counseling, for care of ill, funerals. And then last important one is, it's great to give people time out for bereavement leave, but it's a nightmare when they come back to work and have 1,000 emails waiting in the inbox and still have to go back on that. So find a way of work backup, job share. These are all practical things. And it's one great way of extending compassion for that person to come back to work and not have the whole burden of a week or 2 weeks just waiting for them. So all of these can be unpacked in more detail, but I'll offer this to your human capital team to consider as a formal way of providing for grief support. But what about line managers? And this is where I really want to get to. Line managers are that first line psychological support. We talk about first line care. And, you know, this is a reality for a lot of us. The workplace has become our family, has become our extended home. And I know you know this, but many people find a lot more consolation and support in the workplace. And especially now in this time of COVID and remote working, this has been a distress factor for a lot of people that find work is where I can just get away from the madness of my stress and the chaos of my life, or I'm alone, a single person, and the workplace provides a sense of family and connectedness. So line managers, your role is so critical. And this requires you to also be comfortable with your own grief and start there. And it's not something complicated, but just be in touch with where you are. And it's really calling on our human capabilities. But there are certain skills which a line manager can be more effective in and also learn how to be better at through training, through practice, through coaching. And so I'm just going to walk through some of these very quickly, and then we'll do a little poll to check with you what would be most helpful for you as a line manager. So the first, empathy. So empathy is really saying, I get you, I'm walking in your shoes. And a practical expression of empathy is a sense of presence. So being with someone, even if you don't say anything, just to be with them is a deep expression of empathy. And then in your interaction, if you are engaging them, be honest and sincere. And this really attracts people to you. Your words matter and your actions also matter. So I think the fewer words, the better. And follow it up with action. And so this is the way people know that you genuinely care about them. The second skill is listening. Again, we are not trained or comfortable with listening, especially when it comes to these hard emotions that present itself and these hard situations. As line managers and leaders, we are hardwired to solve problems. That's what we paid for. We're not paid for kind of analyzing and unpacking and listening to issues. We are there to solve problems. And so this is our hardwiring. But now, from a people perspective, we are called to embrace uncertainty, to deal with our own vulnerability, to say, you know, I don't have the answers here, and this is uncomfortable for me, but I'm going to put that in the back and be available to my team members. So this really, listening does require an experience of vulnerability. Third, handling emotions. As I said on Tuesday and today, when people are grieving, you're going to have a range of emotions. You're going to have sadness, anger, frustration, disappointment, blaming. And in the middle of that, you're going to have laughter and joyfulness and just this wonderful remembering of loved ones. So there's a whole range of emotions. And sometimes as a line manager, you feel like, how am I going to cope with all of these? It's okay. Just be present for that. Fourth, and important, is confidentiality. If your staff are going to trust you with very private, very personal information, they need to know that what you receive is going to be handled confidentially. So we encourage, and it's important not to share with others without the permission of those that are talking to you. And the worst thing is for more people to know about what has happened if you shared only with one person. So confidentiality is really, really big. And this builds that trust bridge between you and your team member. And fifth, referral. It'll be good for you to know as a line leader what's available inside the organization, what's available outside. So you almost need to have it in an accessible way so that you can direct your team member for the necessary help and also advocate on their behalf and ask for help, but you know what's available easily. And then the sixth one, I learned more as a line manager myself in this last 18 months. Often when your staff member is grieving or is bereaved, there is a whole team that's also impacted. So how do you give the team permission to have a conversation about grief and bereavement? because it's now not only that one person, it's affecting the whole team. And so here you can learn as a line manager to open up that conversation. And this was one of the questions we had on Tuesday. Should we talk about grief? Yes, and then about grief. So these are just some of the skills that would be helpful for line managers. And I'm going to invite Marina. We've got a quick skills quiz, and she'll lead you through how we want this to be done.
Thank you, Stanley. If you can maybe just stop your sharing, I can share the live Mentipoll. Thank you. So colleagues, if you go to menti.com on your laptop or on your mobile device, you can use the code 4408 5519. And you navigate then into the Mentipoll. You've done it quite a few times already in this series. And what we'd like you to just think about a little bit and give an indication of is, I need to develop these skills to better support my team. If you strongly disagree on any of these or strongly agree, and it'll give us the average of the group just to get an indication of where would one position the support that we give to line leaders around these skills. So you navigate to menti.com and then type in the code 4408 5519. Great, thank you for those first responses, and we can see the empathy. And maybe while we go through it, also in the chat, if you want to add maybe challenges that you have with other challenges that you may have with applying these skills, or ways that you think it can be supported to develop these skills. Okay, so we see listening skills starting to come out on top of this. Yeah, I think what was landing with me strongly, Stanley, when you described these skills now, was that as line and as leaders, we are very much geared to arrange action, or to ensure that people action work and that work gets done. And therefore our skills are probably more honed towards results and outcomes when we find ourselves in a work context. And what we've seen and heard from leaders are that this time have asked of them to produce skills and to do work that have just become part of the job, but that everyone is not necessarily skilled up on, and that the normal leadership capacities and capabilities of listening and empathizing around work issues have now been extended to matters that was very personal before. So I'm guessing it also stretches those skill sets to go beyond what was previously required of leaders, in terms of skills that has the same labels, if I can put it like that. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for the good responses. You can see there that handling emotions, listening, and empathy, your more emotional skills, and then also translating that to your team seems to come out top. Also with confidentiality, I guess it's sometimes conflicting if you sit with information of how it's not going well with people. How do you deal with it? Who do you divulge it to? And what do you do as a leader with that confidential information that has been shared with you? But then also the referral seems to be right in the middle. So the core of the focus is on more the interpersonal and the emotional based skills. Okay, colleagues, thank you very much for sharing. We take all of this input from the core series to help us guide on the well-being frameworks, on the well-being practices in BROL to further build into how do we support employees in this time, and leaders as well. Stanley, back to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Marina. I guess here's the reality. We're not trained to deal with emotions in the workplace. So we often almost have a socialization. Leave your stuff by the door. Don't bring your emotions here. And so that's pretty much the way the industrial workplace has been set up, that we do not have space for emotions. But as we move into a new world of work and what's going to become a hybrid work for a lot of us, we have to start engaging with emotions and not be fearful of them, because this is a natural part of our lives. And I imagine, and I'm predicting, that more and more MBAs in the future are going to be training around these core skills. And I know they're already starting to do this. So this is an important part of work, of leadership, and of showing up as an effective leader. So I want to talk a little bit about compassionate leadership culture. And again, as we're going through this, please make a comment in the chat box about what does this mean for you in practice, and we'll have a bit of a breakaway soon. But compassion is quite a loaded word, and I'm asking, please, in the chat box, how often have you heard compassion being used in the workplace? And if you have, say yes. This is something we don't usually talk about. We leave compassion to the social workers and the churches and the nonprofits and NGOs. But compassion is very core to our experience of life, and leaders that are able to create a compassionate culture have something going. This is really a distinctiveness that makes a difference in organizations and teams where there is an experience of compassionate leadership. So I'll just talk through some of these elements of compassionate leadership. The first one is really creating permission for compassion. And I think we're doing it through this conversation to say it's okay. It's okay to feel and to be concerned about another colleague. And giving colleagues in the workplace, giving staff permission to be interested, to be concerned without being intrusive. And I think there's always a judgment to be made, is something that is welcome. So I want to work in a company where compassion is understood and is experienced. And so often the objection will be, but if we're going to be compassionate, this is this very soft and self-absorbed kind of culture. We're going to be listening to sob stories all the time. And I want to suggest that compassion is really not that. Compassion really demands a lot from us, and it's very intentional. It's very focused. It's not just listening to sob stories. It's not a free for all kind of space, but it's really saying, I know there's a need, both at the individual level, at an organizational level, and how can I be strategic in how we experience and express this? And so compassion has to be balanced with drive for results. So I'm not suggesting a kind of a laissez-faire culture, but how do you still get results in a way that expresses concern for people? And leaders can do this, and sometimes we need to stretch ourselves to be able to do this well. The reality is that we've got to accept that there is going to be reduced productivity when people are grieving. As we've experienced in this last 18 months, there will be reduced productivity. In fact, it's been quite an interesting phenomenon. For some people, working remotely has increased productivity. It's like, okay, I have my own space. I don't have someone breathing over my neck, and it's just blossomed and brought something out. But for others, in the specific moment of bereavement, in that week, in that 2 weeks, in the month, there is going to be reduced productivity because our minds are consumed with this very big emotional, psychological demand on us. So accept that reality and then come around your team member and work out, how do we manage deliverables in this time? So it becomes a conversation that you can have and not one that you should be avoiding. So in that sense, we need to be flexible in terms of task and people management. And organizations that are able to find this flexibility, this balance between task-driven and people-centered are the ones where people want to stay and work at and be at. And a practical way of thinking about a compassionate culture is in the way we communicate. So what are the messages from the CEO, from your COO, from human capital, from you as a divisional head, from you as a line manager? How we speak about grief, how we make ourselves available is also very important. And it's an expression of care. So just go revisit communication, internal communication, especially in the organization at these different levels as an expression of compassionate leadership. And the last element is that of psychological safety. Now, again, this is a concept that's becoming more and more known to many organizations. As psychologists, Marina and myself are really delighted that organizations are thinking more intentionally about psychological safety. But what is this? It's really creating a safe space for people to be able to speak freely, to be able to come and say, I'm not coping, it's tough, to be able to say, I need help. All of those are in practical ways what a psychological safe space is. And so line leaders, line managers, team leaders have the biggest and most critical role in creating psychological safe space. If you can create it in your team, and if teams in the organization create psychological safe space, then as a collective, you get to creating a compassionate leadership culture. And there's many ways of practically expressing compassionate leadership culture. And so this is my invitation to you as managers and leaders. How do you create that space where people want to know that they feel cared for, want to know that you can assist them in delivering their tasks, and knowing a lot of people come to work and they want to know that they are productive. They want to know that they're adding value, but they also want to know that in this moment in time, I'm really struggling. I don't want to feel like I'm failing or disappointing the organization. So how you come alongside is really, really important. So this gives us an opportunity then to go into another conversation about how, as an organization, we can facilitate a compassionate culture. And so we're going to go into a second group discussion and breakout. And we might have a little more time, I imagine, for this. So what we'd like you to do is to share examples of how far we can continue to build a compassionate leadership culture at Broll. What examples at a team level, at a divisional level, at a country level that demonstrate this compassionate leadership culture. So it'd be great for that to be shared, and some of which you might be doing, some of which you can learn from other colleagues. And hopefully this collection of behaviors and actions can become codified into your compassionate leadership culture. So we invite you into the breakouts. And again, I'll pass over to Marina to host this time.
Thank you, Stanley. I think what struck me now from the compassionate culture slide was that, yes, there's this continued requirement of leaders to drive results and to continue with work and the business of the day and why we are here and together in an organization, and how it can be balanced in order to create an environment where people can be productive despite the impact of grief. It is, and that is almost like a paradox, right? If we spend the time to create psychological safety, to create compassion, it almost buys us then the time and the capacity for productivity and for people to do show up at work and to want to do the work, because there's maybe a different purpose that have been created and a different type of relationship that have been created. But we know that also that psychological safe workspaces are in fact more productive and create better outcomes. So leaders, we would love for you to share with one another. We're going from the assumption, which I'm sure is correct, that there's already a compassionate culture at Broll. We saw evidence of that in the recent web and Davos and just from the sharings that we've had from leaders on this Inner Core series. So we offer you now the opportunity to share with one another some very practical ways of how you as a leader do it to balance compassion with results and balance a psychological safe environment with work that actually needs to get done. How do you do it practically? Let's break into these sessions so that we can learn from each other around things that work in your current workspace. Thank you very much, everyone, and welcome back. We want to, we're out of time and we're at the end of our session. So I want to ask you two things. In our group, we had very good practical ways of sharing the compassion, but also balancing it with productivity. Please share your tips in the chat, but I also want you to share on Menti again, same code. What did you find helpful from this session? And what are you taking away with you to take back to your teams in how to facilitate this process of experiencing grief as a line manager? So while you respond to that, I'm going to ask Dr. Stanley just to do a few closing remarks on this topic. Also, if you have any questions, you can post them in the chat, and then we're going to close the session.
Yeah. Thanks, Marina, and thank you all for your active participation. I think don't take for granted the actions that you can take as a leader. And so we heard a few, the tone of voice, not being fully present to your staff, reprioritizing work, often also mediating between team members. And then I want to add to this, to be able to escalate up if you need to renegotiate deliverables, timelines. In my last organization, I just had an unfortunate experience where someone was bereaved and reports were due, and I was kind of in the middle as line manager. So my boss was like, we need this data. We don't have a fully automated system. And so I was really stuck in between having to call someone that's grieving and to find a workaround. And so that's what I eventually had to do. It took a lot more work from me. It was a lot more inefficient, but at least it preserved just that space for that team member not to be dragged back into the work. So I really want to encourage you in any practical way, what you do can make a huge difference. I'm going to end with a little bit of a poem. I'm going to read from John O'Donoghue as you continue your comments on the death of a beloved. I'll just read an extract of it. Though we need to weep your loss, you dwell in that safe place in our hearts where no storm or night or pain can reach you. And so as we consider our loved ones and our own losses, may you continue to inspire us, and this is my encouragement to you and a blessing to you, to enter each day with a generous heart, to serve the call of courage and love until we see your beautiful face again in that land where there is no more separation, where all tears will be wiped from our mind, and where we will never lose you again. May you be blessed, and I wish you well on your grief journey, and as a line manager and leader, I believe you have an important part to play, and I really want to invite you to fully own that space. Thank you very much for having me again, and I'll pass over to you, Marina.
Thank you, Dr. Stanley. In closing, I would like to extend a big thank you to you, Dr. Stanley and Marina, for affording us the time. I hope today's session was of use to everyone in the session. A reminder, the Human Capital Office door is always open. If any of you should have the need to look for advice for a staff member or for yourself, please come chat to us. We'll help you in any way we possibly can. Alternatively, you can contact one of the help or support lines that will be displayed on the screen at the end of the session. For all our brollies outside of South Africa, please contact similar bodies in your regions. Until next time, remember, we are in this together, even though we're all apart. Take care and goodbye.